I didn't know my life would split into a before and an after because of 2 small pieces of metal on my wrists. It started with a comment. His, of course. Quiet enough to sound civilized. Sharp enough to draw blood. Nathan leaned close as we walked into the Whitmore ballroom, his family's world glittering around us like a showroom. Crystal chandeliers, old money laughter, women air kissing like it was an Olympic sport. He glanced down at my suit, charcoal, clean lines, nothing flashy, and murmured, almost amused, "Try not to look like you're here to interview for a job." His mother heard it, smiled. One of his cousins laughed behind a manicured hand. The point wasn't the joke. The point was the audience. I didn't flinch, didn't defend myself, didn't give him the satisfaction of watching me shrink. Because that had been our game for years. Don't react. Let him think he's in control. I drifted toward the back corner of the ballroom, hands in my pockets, perfectly willing to become wallpaper. I wasn't here for the bride. I wasn't here for Nathan either. I was here because he insisted. "It'll look strange if you skip another family event," he'd said earlier, like my presence was a decorative obligation. Then I saw it. The groom's father, mid-conversation, mid-chew, froze as his gaze landed on my wrists, not my face, my cuffs. His jaw stopped moving. His eyes narrowed like he'd just found a stolen artifact sitting under a cheap spotlight. He took one step closer, then another, and his face went pale. He grabbed his son by the elbow and dragged him away from the wedding officiant so fast the poor man stumbled. I didn't hear the whole exchange, just the first harsh whisper that cut through the string quartet like a blade. "Those are custom Mercier cufflinks. Do you have any idea who she is?" A ripple moved through the room. Heads tilted, phones slid out under tables. People stopped laughing at the jokes they'd been rehearsing all week. Nathan didn't notice yet. He was too busy charming an aunt, playing the perfect air. But the air changed. And for the first time in our marriage, the spotlight began to drift, quietly, inevitably, away from him and toward me. I'm 34. On paper, I look unremarkable in the exact way people like Nathan find comforting. Until they don't. I'm not loud. I don't collect attention. I don't post my life in bite-sized proof. I don't talk for the sake of being heard. I've never been good at performing joy on command, never learned the art of laughing a half second too late just to match the room. Nathan used to call it mysterious when we were dating. After we got married, he started calling it boring. I work in consulting. That's the word I used with him, and it wasn't a lie. It was just the kind of truth that comes with a locked drawer. Consulting can mean spreadsheets and strategy decks, or it can mean sitting in rooms where people don't use first names and every sentence costs something. I learned early that the less people know, the safer you are. We met at a charity auction Nathan attended with friends. He wore confidence like a tailored coat, easy smile, polished charm, the kind of man who could make small talk sound like a gift. He wasn't cruel back then. Or maybe he was, and I was simply too soft to call it that. I remember the first thing he said to me, "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." It was meant to be teasing, flirtatious. I smiled politely and said, "You're not wrong." He laughed, too loud, and then leaned in, eyes bright with the thrill of winning someone quiet. Nathan liked puzzles. He liked the chase. And I think he liked that I didn't chase him back. For a while, it was good. Not fairy tale good, just steady. He would text me random observations, send me photos of expensive meals, call me late at night after networking events to tell me which executive said what. I listened. I asked questions. I made him feel interesting. And he made me feel chosen. That's the part people don't like admitting. Even the most self-contained woman in the room can crave being wanted. Not for her usefulness, but for her presence. The signs were small at first. The way he corrected me in front of friends like it was helpful. The way he introduced me without my name. "This is my wife," as if I was a title, not a person. The way he'd roll his eyes when I dressed simply. "Babe, you can't wear that," he'd say, laughing like I was adorable. "We're not in college." But I ignored it because he was still kind and private. still warm when the doors were closed, still capable of holding my hand in the car like he meant it. Then his family entered the frame. Nathan's family wasn't just wealthy, they were trained to be wealthy. Generational confidence. The kind of people who treat other humans like categories: useful, decorative, disposable. His mother, Celeste, liked to study me the way some women study rival brides at weddings. Not to be cruel, Celeste didn't think of it as cruelty. To her, it was quality control. The first time I met her, she kissed my cheek and said, "Oh, you're very understated." Understated. Like a lamp. Like paint. Like something you choose when you can afford better. Nathan's sister, Marianne, was worse because she smiled while she did it. She'd compliment me with words that sounded sweet until you heard the blade underneath. "I love how you don't try," she once said. "It must be so relaxing." I learned quickly. In their world, kindness was currency, and they spent it only when it benefited them. Still, I tried. I attended the brunches, the fundraisers, the family dinners where I sat quietly while they talked about private schools and vacation homes and people's divorces like entertainment. I wore what Nathan preferred. I laughed when he wanted me to. I became small in ways I didn't even notice at first. And Nathan? Nathan began to enjoy that version of me, the version that didn't interrupt his shine, the version that stood half a step behind him and let him feel tall. So when he insisted I attend the Whitmore wedding, another one of his family's major events, I didn't argue. I told myself it was just a night, just a ballroom, just a performance. I didn't realize that night would be the moment the room finally noticed what Nathan never bothered to learn. Not because I hid it, because he never asked. If I'm honest, the shift didn't begin at the wedding. It began long before that. It began the first time Nathan introduced me at a dinner party, and I heard something in his tone that hadn't been there before. "This is my wife, Claire," he said lightly, resting a hand on my back. "She used to travel for work, but she's pretty much retired now. Keeps things simple." Retired. The word landed softly. Too softly. I turned my head slightly. "I'm not retired." He squeezed my back, just a little too firm. "You know what I mean, babe." The couple across from us laughed politely. The subject changed. But I didn't forget. It wasn't the first time he'd edited me mid-sentence. Over the years, the edits became cleaner, smaller, more precise. At a garden luncheon hosted by his mother, Celeste had leaned over her porcelain teacup and asked sweetly, "And what do you do all day, dear? It must be so nice not having to rush around anymore." Before I could answer, Nathan replied smoothly, "She consults occasionally, but nothing too intense. We agreed we didn't need her to stress." We agreed. I remember the way the women at the table nodded approvingly, as if I had chosen domestic obscurity, as if ambition were something you shed like a winter coat. I didn't correct him, not because I couldn't, because I didn't think it mattered. That was my mistake. There were other signs. Nathan began taking credit for decisions I made quietly behind closed doors. A strategic suggestion I offered about one of his father's investments suddenly became something I'd been thinking about for months. He'd tell stories at dinners, embellishing conversations we'd had privately, reshaping them so he was the architect and I was the sounding board. At first, I thought it was insecurity. Then I realized it was branding. He was building a narrative, one where he was the visionary husband with a low-key wife who had once been impressive but chose comfort instead. It fit his family's story better. His friends followed suit. At a rooftop birthday party, one of his colleagues, Julian, raised a glass and joked, "Nathan married well. Stable, calm, no drama. You really picked the safe option." Nathan grinned. "Exactly. I outgrew chaos." Outgrew. Like I was a phase. I smiled politely and took a sip of sparkling water. But something cold slipped under my skin that night, because it wasn't just teasing anymore. It was erasure. We were at a charity board mixer. Nathan had maneuvered his way into a junior committee position and treated it like a crown. I overheard him speaking to a donor near the balcony. "She's on disability, technically," he said casually. "Burned out years ago. High pressure stuff. It's better this way." Disability. My breath stalled. I didn't confront him immediately. I stood there in the shadows and listened to the donor murmur sympathy. Later in the car, I asked quietly, "Why did you say that?" He sighed like I was exhausting. "Claire, it makes people comfortable. They don't like when women are intimidating." "You know what I mean," he said. "You have that whole intense aura sometimes. This smooths things out." Smooths things out. For whom? For his ego. For his audience. For a family that preferred wives ornamental, not strategic. I didn't threaten divorce. I just watched. And I noticed something else during those months. His subtle enjoyment. The way he'd glance at me during family dinners after diminishing my career. The faint flicker of relief when someone praised him for carrying the weight. He liked being the sun. He liked believing I orbited him, and I let him. Not because I was weak, but because I understood something he didn't. You can't erase a woman who built herself in silence. You can only underestimate her. By the time we walked into that wedding ballroom, Nathan thought he knew exactly who I was. A safe wife. A softened version. A background detail. He never once looked closely at my wrists. He never once asked about Geneva. He never once wondered why certain calls came in from numbers that never left voicemails. He assumed that if I wasn't announcing my worth, it must not exist. That night, when the groom's father went pale at the sight of my cufflinks, that wasn't the beginning of my power. It was simply the moment Nathan's illusion started to crack, and he still hadn't noticed. The vows were halfway through when I felt the room tilt. It wasn't dramatic, no gasp, no dropped glass, just a subtle reorientation of gravity. The groom's father had returned to his seat after that first pale reaction, but he wasn't listening to the ceremony anymore. His phone was in his hand beneath the tablecloth, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking toward me every 30 seconds like he was confirming I hadn't disappeared. I kept my posture relaxed, hands folded, expression neutral. Nathan stood beside me during the vows, smiling at the bride, like a man who believed he understood how rooms worked. He didn't. The first whisper reached us from behind. "That can't be her." "It is. Look at the cuffs. Why would she be here?" Nathan shifted slightly. "What are they talking about?" he murmured. I didn't answer, because at that exact moment, the groom's father rose from his chair. No announcement, no microphone yet. He simply stood. And people noticed. The string quartet faltered half a beat. He walked, not hurried, not nervous, directly toward me. The path cleared instinctively. When he stopped in front of us, Nathan's smile sharpened into something rehearsed. "Mr. Whitmore," Nathan said warmly, extending a hand. "Congratulations. Beautiful ceremony." The older man didn't take it. His eyes were on me. Up close, I could see recognition settling fully into place. "Claire Mercer," he said quietly. He said my full name. Nathan froze beside me. I inclined my head slightly. "Good evening." There was a pause. A long one. The kind that makes a ballroom feel suddenly too small. Whitmore's expression shifted. Not fear exactly, but respect layered with disbelief. "We weren't informed you'd be attending." "I wasn't aware I required clearance," I replied calmly. A few nearby guests stopped pretending not to listen. Nathan's hand lowered slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, forcing a laugh. "You two know each other?" Whitmore didn't look at him. "I'm familiar with your wife's work." "Your wife." The words hung there. Nathan's spine straightened. "Work?" "Yes," Whitmore said evenly. "The Argentine reversal. The Vortic stabilization. Geneva." Each word was quiet. Each word was a match. Nathan turned to me, confusion breaking through his composure. "Geneva?" he repeated. I could feel his eyes searching my face like I might deny it. I didn't. Whitmore leaned slightly closer. "You saved 3 of my partners from catastrophic exposure in 2009, he said softly. "You never asked for recognition." "That wasn't the agreement," I replied. "Agreement." Nathan's breathing changed. Whitmore stepped back, finally acknowledging him with a brief glance. "You've been married to one of the most discreet crisis architects of the last 15 years, he said. impressive. It wasn't praise for Nathan. It was a fact delivered like a verdict. Then, without further ceremony, Whitmore nodded respectfully to me and returned to his table. The silence he left behind was louder than applause. Nathan stared at me. "What was that?" he demanded under his breath. His voice wasn't playful anymore. It wasn't superior. It was uncertain. "Just consulting," I said. His laugh cracked. "Consulting doesn't make men like that pale." Around us, guests were pretending to resume conversations, but phones were out. Messages were being typed. Names were being searched. Nathan grabbed my elbow. "Claire," he hissed, smile frozen for appearances. "What is happening?" I gently removed his hand from my arm. "You never asked," I said quietly. He blinked rapidly. "Asked what?" "What I actually did." His jaw tightened. "You told me you left that world." "I did." "You told me you wanted quiet." "I do." He leaned closer, voice trembling now. "Then why do they look at you like that?" "Because in rooms like this, silence isn't absence, it's leverage." But I didn't say that. Instead, I looked toward the head table where Celeste was whispering urgently to Marianne, their composure cracking for the first time in years. "They're calling you by your name," Nathan said. "Yes." "Why haven't I heard it before?" I met his eyes. "Because you were too busy explaining me." The weight of that landed slowly. Behind him, a photographer subtly repositioned, lens angling toward us. Flash. Nathan flinched at the light. I didn't. The groom's father stood again, this time with a microphone. "I'd like to say something," he announced smoothly. Nathan's fingers tightened at his sides. "Please don't," he muttered under his breath. "Not to Whitmore. To me." But the speech had already begun. Whitmore spoke of family, of integrity, of rare individuals whose contributions reshape markets quietly. Then he turned and pointed. "To Claire Mercer," he said clearly, "a woman whose work most of you have benefited from without ever knowing her name." The room went still. 300 people. No music. No clinking glasses. Just the sound of Nathan's certainty collapsing beside me. I didn't stand. I didn't smile. I simply inclined my head slightly. Whitmore finished with, "We're fortunate she's here tonight." Applause came slowly. Not explosive. Measured. Respectful. Nathan didn't clap. He was staring at me like I was someone else entirely. And maybe, to him, I was. Because the woman he'd been editing, minimizing, softening for years had just been introduced to the room without his permission, and there was nothing he could do to take it back. He swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, voice barely audible. "I was never hiding," I said. "You just never cared enough to look." Nathan didn't move for several seconds after the applause faded. He stood there in the middle of the ballroom, perfect tuxedo, perfect posture. Except his expression was no longer curated. It was searching, unsteady. Like someone who had just realized the script in his hands was missing entire pages. "What else don't I know?" he asked quietly. The question wasn't angry yet. It was wounded. And for a fleeting second, something inside me softened. Because this wasn't the smug man correcting me at garden brunches. This was a husband who had just discovered he'd built confidence on incomplete information. But then I remembered the word disability. I remembered him telling donors I was burned out. I remembered the gentle squeeze on my back when he'd interrupted me mid-sentence. And the softness dissolved. "You know what I told you," I replied evenly. "I consulted internationally. I stepped away." "That's not the same as," he gestured vaguely toward the head table. "That." "What is that, Nathan?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Men like Whitmore don't react like that unless..." "Unless what?" I asked. "Unless you're..." He stopped. "Important?" I finished for him. His jaw tightened. "I never said you weren't important. You implied it." His eyes flicked around the room. People were still glancing our way. Conversations were thinner now, curious. "I didn't know," he insisted. "I know." That was the truth. He didn't know because he never tried to. He studied market reports more carefully than he studied his own wife. He memorized board members' bios, but never asked about Geneva. "Why didn't you correct me?" he pressed. "When?" I asked calmly. At the charity mixer where you told them I was on disability, or the rooftop party where you said I was retired?" His face went pale. "You heard that?" "Yes." "And you didn't say anything?" "No." "Why?" "Because I was watching. Because silence reveals more than confrontation. Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. But I didn't say that. Instead, I answered honestly, because I was trying to understand whether you believed it." His shoulders dropped slightly. "I was just smoothing things," he muttered. "For whom?" "For us." I held his gaze. "No," I said softly. "For you." That landed. His throat moved as he swallowed. Across the ballroom, Celeste was approaching us with measured steps. Marianne, just behind her, eyes sharp with calculation. Nathan noticed them too. "Please," he whispered urgently, "just don't escalate this." Escalate. As if I had orchestrated the speech. As if I'd requested recognition. "I haven't done anything," I said. "That's the problem," he replied. I almost smiled, because that was the first honest thing he'd said all night. Celeste reached us, her expression composed, but tight around the edges. "Claire," she began delicately, "what an unexpected surprise." Her tone carried the faintest edge of accusation. "I didn't realize I required disclosure," I answered politely. Marianne crossed her arms subtly. "It would have been courteous." "Courteous to whom?" I asked. "To family," Celeste said quickly. "Family. The same family that nodded approvingly when I was minimized. The same family that laughed at the retired narrative." Nathan stepped in. "Mom, it's fine." But it wasn't fine. Marianne tilted her head. "You let everyone believe you were less involved professionally." I met her eyes calmly. "I never told anyone that." Nathan's silence beside me was louder than any admission. Celeste's gaze flicked to him. "Nathan?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. And that hesitation was everything. Because now they were recalculating him. Not me. "You said she stepped back," Marianne pressed. "She did," Nathan said defensively, "years ago." "I stepped away from active crisis work," I clarified, "not from competence." Celeste's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well," she said lightly, "this has certainly created conversation." "Yes," I agreed. "And the online speculation," Marianne began. Nathan stiffened. "Online?" I didn't respond. My phone buzzed again in my hand. Nathan looked down instinctively. His eyes widened. "What is that?" "Nothing dramatic," I said. "Just curiosity." He pulled out his own phone. Within seconds, I watched the blood drain from his face again. A blurry image of me near the lounge. A headline forming. A question circulating. He stared at the screen like it had betrayed him personally. "This can't," he began, but it could. And it was. He looked at me, panic creeping in now. Make it stop. The irony almost hurt. He had spent years shaping narratives about me. Now a narrative was forming that he couldn't control. "I didn't start it," I said gently. "But you could end it," he insisted. I studied him carefully. The man who once laughed when I wore understated suits. The man who told donors I was finished. The man who believed being quiet meant being small. "Why would I asked softly. His eyes flashed. "Because we're married." There it was. The final appeal. Not love. Not apology. Alignment. I inhaled slowly. "I've always been married to you," I said. "You just weren't always married to me." The music resumed behind us, louder this time, trying to restore normalcy. But the room felt different now. Not explosive, not chaotic, just altered. Nathan stood there, caught between defending me publicly and explaining me privately. And for the first time in our marriage, he didn't know which version of me he was supposed to manage. Because the quiet woman he thought he understood wasn't asking for permission anymore. By the time dinner was served, the ballroom had split into two distinct conversations. The visible one, about the bride, the cake, the honeymoon in Lake Como, and the real one, about me. I could feel it in the pauses, in the way laughter cut off when I passed, in the way certain men straightened slightly when our eyes met. Nathan sat beside me, rigid. His knee bounced under the table. His phone lit up every 30 seconds. Celeste leaned across him at one point, voice low and sharp. "You need to handle this." He swallowed. "Handle what?" "This perception issue. Perception. They were still trying to frame it as an optics problem. Marianne added quietly, if she's been operating at that level, people are going to ask why we didn't know. Nathan glanced at me. I kept my posture relaxed, cutting my fillet with measured precision, because this wasn't my scandal. It was his. Across the table, a cousin I barely knew cleared his throat. So, Claire, he began carefully, which firms did you consult for? Nathan opened his mouth immediately. She did independent advisory work for sovereign debt stabilization and crisis restructuring, I said gently, without raising my voice. Silence. Forks paused midair. Celeste blinked. Marianne's wineglass stopped just short of her lips. The cousin nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. That explains Geneva, he murmured. Nathan turned to me, stunned. You worked with governments? He asked under his breath. I advised them, I corrected softly. How much of this is still active? Enough. He stared at me like he was trying to reconcile two images that refused to overlap. The woman who folded laundry on Sundays. The woman who once negotiated terms that moved markets. The contradiction unsettled him because he preferred clarity, preferred knowing exactly where he stood. And tonight, he wasn't sure anymore. The whispers intensified. A man from a competing investment group approached our table mid-dinner. Claire, he said respectfully, we met briefly in Luxembourg. You probably don't remember. I do, I replied. You were restructuring North Atlantic portfolios. Nathan's hand tightened around his glass. They spoke for 3 minutes. Not loudly, not theatrically. Just efficiently. When the man left, he gave me a nod that carried weight. Nathan leaned toward me immediately. Why didn't you ever bring me to those rooms? I turned to him slowly. You never asked to come. That's not fair. No, I agreed quietly. It isn't. Across the ballroom, Celeste was speaking urgently to Whitmore. I caught fragments. Miscommunication. Family clarity. Whitmore's response was brief and final. He shook his head once. Celeste returned to the table with a composure so tight it looked painful. This situation, she said coolly, is becoming distracting. Nathan bristled. She didn't do anything. The shift was subtle, but I noticed it. For the first time that night, he wasn't correcting me. He was defending me. Marianne leaned in. You let us believe you were retired. I let Nathan speak for me, I replied calmly. That sentence landed harder than accusation. Nathan's breath caught. You're making me look incompetent, he whispered. I'm not making you look anything, I answered. I'm simply not shrinking. His jaw clenched. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw it clearly. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Because the social order he understood had inverted. He wasn't the sun tonight. He was orbiting something he hadn't studied. Phones continued buzzing across the room. A finance blog had already published a speculative piece. Industry forums were connecting dots. Old photos resurfaced. Nathan's phone vibrated again. He glanced at it, and his face went white. What? I asked quietly. He turned the screen toward me. A headline. Discreet architect behind Vortic crisis seen at Whitmore wedding. Below it, a smaller line. Sources say Mercer stepped away voluntarily in 2015. Voluntarily. Not burned out, not disabled. Voluntarily. Nathan looked sick. I told people you couldn't handle the pressure, he said faintly. I know. He pressed a hand to his forehead. They're going to think I lied. Did you? He looked at me sharply. I simplified. For yourself, I corrected. Across the room, I saw a different shift. Guests were no longer whispering about me. They were whispering about him. Why hadn't he known? Why had he framed it differently? Was he unaware or worse, threatened? Celeste's voice cut in again. You need to make a statement, she told Nathan. A statement? He repeated. Yes, clarify. Control the narrative. Control. Always control. Nathan looked at me. Help me, he said quietly. There was no arrogance in it now. No polish. Just vulnerability. And for a moment, I considered it. Because I loved him once. Maybe I still did. But love doesn't survive erasure indefinitely. You don't need help, I said softly. You need honesty. He flinched. You're enjoying this. Marianne accused suddenly. I turned toward her slowly. No, I said calmly. I'm simply not hiding. That's convenient, she snapped. It's accurate. Nathan stood abruptly. I need air, he muttered. He walked toward the terrace, shoulders tense. I watched him go. The man who once narrated my life for social comfort, now forced to confront a version of me that required no narration. Whitmore approached again, briefly. You handled that gracefully, he said quietly. I didn't handle anything, I replied. The truth did. He smiled faintly. Most people can't withstand being underestimated for that long. I wasn't underestimated, I said. I was ignored. He nodded thoughtfully and stepped away. The band began playing louder music. Dancing resumed cautiously, but the hierarchy had shifted. Not explosively. Not dramatically. Just enough. When Nathan returned from the terrace, his composure had thinned. Claire, he said softly, sitting beside me again. Did you ever plan to tell me everything? I considered the question carefully. I planned to stay married, I said. That's not the same. No, I agreed. It isn't. He looked at me like he was seeing the marriage itself differently. Not broken. Not yet, but cracked. Because he was realizing something uncomfortable. He hadn't married a quiet wife. He'd married a woman who chose quiet. And there's a difference. A dangerous one. His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a headline. It was a message from a donor. Did you know about this? We should talk. Nathan stared at it, breathing shallow. The escalation wasn't mine. It was the natural consequence of a story told too long without verification. And as the night deepened, one truth settled between us, heavier than any accusation. He didn't lose the room because of me. He lost it because he never truly saw who was standing beside him. And now everyone else did. The drive home was silent. Not the comfortable kind. Not the reflective kind. The kind where every unspoken word sits between two people like shattered glass. Nathan kept both hands on the steering wheel, knuckles pale under the streetlights. His jaw worked as if he were rehearsing something. An apology, an argument, a defense. None of it made it past his lips. I watched the city blur past the window. For years, I had chosen stillness inside our marriage. I had told myself that love meant adaptation, that not correcting him publicly was grace, that letting him shine was partnership. But tonight exposed something deeper. I hadn't been protecting the marriage. I had been protecting him, and he had been protecting an image. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine but didn't move. Claire, he said finally, voice lower than I'd heard in years. I didn't think you felt diminished. That word landed gently and painfully. I didn't, I said honestly. He frowned. Then what is this? He looked at me like that answer wasn't enough. Inside the house, the air felt different, quieter, almost unfamiliar. I slipped off my heels and placed them neatly by the door. The small domestic ritual felt strangely grounding after the evening's tension. Nathan stood in the middle of the living room. You let them think I didn't know, he said. I didn't correct them, I answered, which is the same thing. No, I said gently, it isn't. His frustration sharpened. You could have told them, we just never discussed it in detail. But we didn't, I replied. He ran a hand through his hair again, pacing now. Why didn't you fight me on it? On the disability comment, on retirement? I watched him carefully. Would you have listened? He opened his mouth, closed it. And that silence answered for him. The truth settled heavily between us. I hadn't confronted him because somewhere along the way, I realized he preferred the version of me that required no adjustment. The manageable wife, the softened narrative, and I chose peace over correction. But peace built on misrepresentation isn't peace. It's postponement. He stopped pacing. You made me look like I was ashamed of you. You were, I said quietly. The words were soft, but they cut. I wasn't ashamed, he protested. You just didn't want me too large in the room. His eyes flashed. That's not fair. It's accurate. He stared at me, wounded. I married you because you were steady, he said. Because you weren't like the women in my world. You didn't compete. You didn't posture. And now? I asked. He hesitated. And now I don't know where I fit. There it was. Not anger. Displacement. Because if I wasn't small, then he wasn't automatically bigger. And that threatened the balance he'd built. I walked toward the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hands steady. Behind me, his voice softened. "Did you ever feel alone?" he asked. The question surprised me. I turned slowly. "Yes." He flinched. "Why didn't you say something? I thought you liked it quiet." His shoulders sagged. I didn't realize silence meant distance. I almost smiled at the irony. For me, silence was strength. For him, it was absence. Two languages spoken under the same roof. He moved closer now, tentative. "Are you leaving?" he asked. The vulnerability in that question hit somewhere deeper than the ballroom ever could. Because this was the part no audience could see. The private fracture. "I don't know," I said honestly. His breath caught. "I love you," he said. And for the first time that night, my composure trembled slightly because I believed him. In his way, he did. But love without curiosity becomes ownership. And ownership erases. I leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. "Do you love me?" I asked quietly. "Or the version of me that didn't disrupt your story?" He didn't answer immediately. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know." That was the darkest moment of the night. Not the speech. Not the headlines. Not the whispers. This. The realization that our marriage might have been built on an edited file. Not lies. Just omissions. I felt something inside me crack. Not rage, not devastation. Just a quiet understanding. I had spent years choosing restraint, but restraint is only noble when it's mutual. Nathan looked at me like he was losing something he hadn't realized was fragile. "I need time," he said. "So do I replied. He nodded slowly, as if bracing himself. And for the first time in our marriage, the silence between us wasn't comfortable. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't protective. It was uncertain. And uncertainty, I've learned, is where real change either begins or ends everything. The morning after the wedding didn't feel explosive. It felt quiet. Too quiet. Nathan had left early for a damage control breakfast with one of his father's associates. He said it lightly, like a joke, but his tie was pulled too tight, and he avoided my eyes when he walked out the door. I stayed home. Not hiding, thinking. My phone had stopped buzzing aggressively overnight. The speculation had settled into something calmer. Analysis, not gossip. The narrative forming wasn't scandalous. It was factual. And in that calm, something became very clear to me. This wasn't about reputation. It was about alignment. Around 10 a.m., my phone rang. "Unknown number," I answered. "Claire." The voice was female, controlled, measured. It took me a second. "Margot?" Margot Lemaire had once chaired a regulatory review panel in Brussels. A woman who rarely wasted words. "I saw the coverage," she said. No greeting, no preface. "I assumed you might." A faint exhale on the other end. Not irritation, recognition. "You're back in circulation," she said. I didn't intend to be. "That doesn't matter." Silence. Then she added, "You always had the option to disappear permanently. You didn't." She wasn't accusing me. She was testing me. "I stepped away by choice," I replied. "I didn't vanish." "And now?" she asked. I looked out the window at the perfectly trimmed hedges Nathan took pride in. There was a pause. "You built credibility that most people never even glimpse," she continued. "You handed it over to silence. That was your decision. But silence doesn't protect marriages." The bluntness made me inhale sharply. "I'm aware." Another beat. "Are you being diminished?" she asked. The question was so direct, it startled me. "No," I said, then corrected myself. "Not anymore." Good, she said, because the moment you tolerate erasure, you teach people how to rewrite you. That sentence landed deeper than anything said at the wedding. I thanked her. We ended, but something in me shifted. Not ambition. Not ego. Clarity. Around noon, Nathan came home earlier than expected. His face was pale. He didn't. They're restructuring the board, he said without greeting. Which board? I asked calmly. The non helped me get on. I let that pass. And, I prompted. He swallowed. You've been recommended for advisory oversight. I blinked once. By whom? They wouldn't say, but the recommendation carried weight. Of course it did. Nathan stepped closer. They're asking whether you'd consider a seat. There it was. Not gossip. Not speculation. Opportunity. And Nathan's expression wasn't proud. It was uncertain. Do you want it? He asked. The question mattered, because for years I had folded my trajectory neatly around his. I could feel the crossroads clearly now. If I accepted, the dynamic would never return to its old shape. If I declined, I would be choosing the familiar version of us. I haven't decided, I said honestly. Nathan studied me. I didn't know you still had that kind of pull, he admitted quietly. I didn't lose it, I replied. I just stopped using it. He looked at me differently then, not smaller, not larger, just differently. I need to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. When you heard me tell people you were burned out, why didn't you confront me? I considered that carefully. Because I wanted to see if you'd correct it yourself. He winced. I didn't. No. Silence. Then he did something unexpected. He sat down. Not pacing. Not performing. Just sitting. I was afraid, he admitted. The vulnerability in his voice was real. Of what? I asked gently. That if you were bigger than me, I'd disappear. The honesty in that sentence shifted everything. Because finally, we weren't talking about headlines. We were talking about fear. I walked toward him slowly. You were never competing with me, I said. You were competing with an idea. He looked up. And now? Now, I said softly. I'm done shrinking. The words weren't threatening. They were final. Not an ultimatum, a boundary. He nodded slowly. I don't want you to shrink, he said. But you'll have to grow, I replied. That was the turning point. Not the wedding speech. Not the headlines. Not the board offer. This. The moment he understood that loving me meant standing beside me, not ahead of me. And the moment I understood that staying meant no longer editing myself for comfort. My phone buzzed again. A formal email. Board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. Attendance requested. Nathan watched my face as I read it. Well, he asked quietly. I looked at him. Then at the email. Then back at him. I'm going, I said. Not because I needed validation. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I refused to pretend smaller than I was. And whatever happened next, inside the boardroom or inside our marriage, it would happen without me dimming first. The board meeting was held in a glass building Nathan had once described to me as aspirational. He used to point at it when we drove downtown. One day, he'd say lightly, I'll be making decisions in rooms like that. The irony didn't escape me as I stepped through the revolving doors alone. Nathan had offered to come. I told him no. This wasn't a spectacle. It wasn't a power play. It was alignment. The conference room was quiet when I entered. 6 members, 2 donors, 1 legal advisor. No cameras, no applause, just scrutiny. I greeted them calmly and took the empty seat at the end of the table. The chairwoman, Evelyn Hart, spoke first. We appreciate your willingness to meet on short notice, Claire. I understand there are concerns, I replied. Evelyn didn't smile. There are questions. Fair. Another member leaned forward. You were presented publicly as inactive professionally. That appears inaccurate. It was incomplete, I said evenly. A beat of silence. Why didn't you correct it? Someone asked. Because it wasn't relevant to my advisory capacity here. Reputation is always relevant, the legal advisor noted. Yes, I agreed. Which is why I'm here now. The room studied me, measured, clinical. No one was impressed by cufflinks here. Only substance. Evelyn folded her hands. You've been recommended not just to remain on the board, she said, but to chair oversight for strategic allocations. That was bigger than I'd expected. I kept my face neutral. And Nathan? Someone asked carefully. He was under the impression he was representing your joint involvement. There it was. The real issue. I don't operate jointly, I said calmly. not professionally. The air shifted slightly, not scandal. Clarification. Evelyn nodded slowly. If you accept this role, it will redefine how you're positioned publicly. I'm aware. And your marriage? She asked without flinching. I held her gaze. My marriage will adapt, I said. The meeting lasted 42 minutes. No dramatics, no speeches, just data, discretion, and decisions. When it ended, Evelyn stood and extended her hand. Welcome back, she said quietly. Not welcome to the board. Welcome back. I shook her hand once. Firm, steady. Outside the building, I allowed myself a single breath that felt like release, not triumph. Clarity. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Nathan. How did it go? I typed back. Productive. He responded within seconds. They called me. That made me pause. About whether I misrepresented you intentionally. There it was. The fallout. Not loud. Not explosive. Just professional recalibration. I imagined the conversation, the polite tone, the subtle implication. If he didn't know, he was negligent. If he did know, he was dishonest. Neither looked good. What did you say? I asked. There was a long pause before he replied. That I underestimated my wife. I stopped walking. Read that again. Not blamed, not deflected, owned. And, I typed, and that won't happen again. I exhaled slowly. By evening, the ripple was complete. Industry forums reframed the narrative. Not mystery. Not scandal. Claire Mercer resumes active advisory presence. Nathan's name appeared only in passing, as spouse. A footnote. I knew that would sting, because for years, I had been the footnote. When I arrived home, he was sitting at the kitchen table. No jacket, no phone in his hand, just him. They restructured my role, he said quietly. How? I asked. I'm no longer liaison for external relations. That had been his pride. His stage. And they said it would reduce perception conflict. He didn't say embarrassment, but I heard it. I set my bag down gently. I'm sorry, I said honestly. He looked up sharply. Are you? Yes. Why? Because this isn't punishment, I replied. It's consequence. The word hung there. He nodded slowly. I told them I'd support your appointment, he said. I studied him. You didn't have to. I know. Silence. Then he added, softer. They asked if I felt threatened. And? I said yes. The honesty in that answer surprised me. Why? I asked. Because I built my confidence around being the stronger one, he admitted. And that wasn't fair. I moved closer, resting my hands lightly on the back of the chair across from him. This was never about stronger, I said. It was about truth. He nodded. I see that now. The fallout wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches. No social exile. Just adjustment. His invitations slowed slightly. Mine increased. People stopped asking him about my retirement. They asked him how I was managing oversight. He felt the shift. But he didn't resist it. That mattered. Later that night, Celeste called him. I overheard part of it. Unexpected. Optics. Family positioning. Nathan listened. Then said something I didn't expect. Mom, she's not positioning. She's qualified. I felt that in my chest. Not victory. Validation. When he hung up, he looked tired. They'll adjust, he said. They always do. And us, he asked. I met his eyes. That depends. On what? On whether you love who I am, I said softly, or who I was convenient to be. He didn't answer immediately, but he didn't look away either. And sometimes that's the beginning. Not of redemption, of recalibration, because the room had shifted. The board had shifted. The narrative had shifted. And now the only question left was whether our marriage could shift too, or whether it had been built too tightly around a version of me that no longer existed. 3 weeks later, the noise had settled. Not disappeared. Settled. The headlines moved on. Markets found new drama. Weddings happened without incident. But something fundamental had changed. quietly, permanently. Nathan adjusted. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But deliberately. He stopped speaking for me in rooms, stopped softening my resume into something digestible, stopped introducing me as retired. The first time he said it publicly, at a small dinner with colleagues, I felt the difference. "This is my wife, Claire," he said simply. "She advises on sovereign restructuring and crisis frameworks." No embellishment, no editing, no apology in his tone, just fact. He glanced at me after, not for approval, but for alignment. I nodded once. That was enough. At home, our conversations changed too. We talked about fear openly now, about insecurity, about the quiet competition neither of us admitted we were participating in. "I thought if you were bigger," he told me one night, "I'd disappear." "You don't disappear when someone stands taller," I replied. "You grow." He didn't argue. He listened. That was new. I accepted the board oversight role, not because I needed visibility, but because I refused invisibility. There's a difference. And here's the part no one teaches you. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't chase cameras or demand applause. It enters quietly. It speaks rarely. And it never repeats itself to be believed. Nathan thought strength looked like marble floors and VIP seating. I let him think that. But strength looks like knowing your value, even when someone tries to narrate you smaller. It looks like standing still while the room recalibrates. It looks like saying calmly, "You never asked." Our marriage didn't explode. It evolved. Slowly. Intentionally. Because love isn't about shrinking for comfort. It's about standing side by side without needing one person dimmer. And if there's one thing I learned from that ballroom, it's this. Never confuse quiet with small. Some women don't glow loudly. They build the light source. And when they finally step forward, the room adjusts. Not because they demanded it, but because it was always theirs.